Well, it is an absolute honor and a privilege to be here today with Calvin Tomkins, who I have no other way to describe him but as a legend and a national, or in this case, international treasure. And it is really, I'm so thankful that you made the effort also of coming and seeing the exhibition. Introducing Calvin, or Ted as he's known mysteriously, I still don't know why, but it's not an easy feat. But Calvin started his career actually as a writer, and maybe you'll tell us that you lived in Mexico, and I believe he wrote his first novel in Mexico, but maybe he'll tell us a little more about it. And then he joined Newsweek in 1957, and he worked there and eventually joined the New Yorker, I believe, in 1960. Since then, he's been writing and chronicling the art world and speaking, to use the metaphor of keeping the candle lit. He's certainly one of the people who has kept that candle going for a long time. I like to describe him using a metaphor that Marcel Duchamp created. I like to describe him as the oculist witness of a good 60 and plus years of modern and contemporary art. So as I said, he joined the New Yorker in 1962. He published his first profile about Jean Tinguely, and then went on to write about art in the 1960s, about John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, Merce Cunningham. The essays around these characters eventually were collected in a wonderful book called The Bride and the Bachelors. He would go on and write again about Rauschenberg multiple times, eventually publishing a book about him titled Off the Wall. In 1966, he published his first monograph on Marcel Duchamp, whom he met, I believe, in 1957, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then in 1996, he published the still canonical biography of Marcel Duchamp, and in 2013 released a wonderful little book called The Afternoon Interviews, which collects his conversations with Marcel Duchamp. He has written dozens of other books. Sometimes I tease him saying he's the Vasari of the contemporary art world, and in fact one of his books is titled Lives of Artists. But my favorite title among all the ones he published is Living Well is the Best Revenge, which I hope serves as also a motto for all his life. It's never nice to mention the age, but I think at 93, Calvin has really had an incredible contribution to the world of contemporary art, and so it's really amazing to have him here today. So with Calvin, we have the unique opportunity of talking to somebody who has met and worked and seen both Marcel Duchamp and Jeff Koons in action. So I will start by asking you, first of all, when did you meet Marcel Duchamp?
I should say first that that advancing years have created a situation in which I really think I can say that I have forgotten more about Marcel Duchamp than anybody alive. So there will be memory lapses may occur. But
so when did you meet him?
I met him in 1959. At that time, I was working for Newsweek. In the foreign news department, and Newsweek at that time and Time also had no art coverage, no regular coverage of the visual arts. It covered film and theater and music and all sorts of other things, but not the visual arts, which was an indication of how unimportant the contemporary art seemed to the ordinary middle class American reader. But once in a while, an editor at Newsweek would come across an art story that he thought might be worthwhile. And in 1959, which was the year that the first really major monograph on Duchamp was published in France and also in New York, he thought that maybe this should be an art story. I should also say that at this time, Duchamp was almost forgotten. He had been, very few people knew that was living in New York, had become an American citizen, but he just had dropped off the map of the art world. And so this editor thought, well, this is maybe a story. So the person he called to do it was me. He said, go and interview Marcel Duchamp. And I had no idea what. Of course, I knew that he was an artist who had done a very famous painting called Nude Descending a Staircase at the Armory, and in 1915, and had been very important in the Dada movement, the Surrealist movement, without joining either one. But by the 1940s and 50s, he had begun to fade out. And most people didn't know that he was still alive, even. So anyway, I had about 45 minutes to read a little bit of the book, the monograph. But as you may imagine, my questions to Duchamp, whom I met by arrangement at the King Cole Bar of the St. Regis Hotel, most of my questions were predictably dumb. But he did this strange thing. He was able to turn them into something interesting. For instance, I asked him, how do you spend your time now that you have stopped making art? Which was the common perception at the time, that he had given up art for chess and he was no longer making works of art. I didn't have any idea that at the time he had been working on a major installation, working on for 20 years in secret. But he said, "Oh, I'm a respirateur. I'm a breather," and I enjoy it very much. And then he went on to say he doesn't see why people felt that they had to work. Work seemed to be a very boring thing to do. But anyway, every question I asked, he turned into something interesting, and I began to think, this is the most amazing human being I've ever met, and it became a lifelong obsession. I've been thinking about him ever since, and then I knew him for the last 10 years of his life. We saw each other relatively often, and I just still hardly a day goes by that I don't think about it.
Speaking of his presumed laziness, famously his friend Henri Pierre Rocher said that his masterwork was his use of time.
His use of time.
That he was able to do nothing and everything. Yeah. But during that encounter, I remember you also mentioned something about the painting. So if you're familiar with this bar, which is still there at the St. Regis, has this fresco behind. I forgot the author, but it's a relatively kitschy scene. And
monumentally kitschy.
And
it's a shame it's no longer there, but it was King Cole and his merry men enjoying some sort of banquet.
And I remember you asked Duchamp about it, no? You say, what do you think? You wanted to impress him with your...
I said that's really engaging kitsch, isn't it? And he said, oh, no, I think it's quite interesting.
So how would you describe him at the time or throughout the years? I know it's difficult to describe somebody who has been the object of your fascination for so long, but what would you say that it was like to be around him at that time, or what struck you about him?
Well, he had this strange combination of qualities. One was an absolute serenity. He was never startled. He seemed to be completely at ease with himself and with the world. But the other was his humor, which was largely based on irony. But he was the thing. In many ways, Duchamp and Koons are absolute polar opposites. After all, Duchamp was French, even though he became an American citizen. He kept on being a French, and he had many centuries of French thought. He was a Cartesian thinker. I think, therefore I am, as Descartes said, was very much could have been his motto. And he, so he was at odds with much of the art that had gone on in the world, and particularly in New York during the abstract expressionist period. But his main bete noire was what he called retinal art, art that appeals only to the eye and not to the mind. One of his goals was to put art once again at the service of the mind.
So on that occasion you met him and you published a piece in Newsweek, right? In 50.
Published it in Newsweek.
And that was the first time you ever wrote about him. And
Yes.
Do you know if he read that article, or did you ever know if he ever read any of your books about him?
No idea. The only thing I know is that when the New Yorker profile came out, I had met Teenie Duchamp, his wife, and at a dinner party one night, she said, "You know, Marcel never read the profile," which I thought was entirely characteristic.
And much of your early writing, besides Duchamp, is about the circle of so-called neo-Dadaists. So Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Merce Cunningham, and John Cage. Did you meet any of them through Duchamp, or the other way around, or how were those relationships developed?
No, I didn't meet them through Duchamp. Actually, it was from the first profile on Jean Tinguely. In researching that, several people told me, you must talk to Bob Rauschenberg. They know each other and admire. And so I talked to Rauschenberg, and that led to a profile of Rauschenberg, and that led to a profile of John Cage, and then eventually back to Duchamp.
And how did they perceive Duchamp, this circle of, let's say, friends who were also your peers from the same generation?
Yeah, I think they sort of looked upon him as a distant god. None of them really had personal meetings with him. Rauschenberg and Cage had, I think they said they had 8 or 9 meetings with him in all. They made a point of trying to meet him. But Cage always said that he felt he couldn't impose on Duchamp, that he would love to know him, but he couldn't impose upon his time. And yet, eventually, he got over that by asking if Duchamp would give him chess lessons. And so he went to the Duchamp's apartment one night a week, and Duchamp's method of teaching was very zen. Cage would play chess with Teenie, who was a very good player. And every so often, Marcel would come over to look at the board and said, "You're both playing very badly."
Do you play chess at all?
I played for a little while. Dodie and I sort of took it up. I've never become a real chess player. Francis Naumann was the one who told me I had to learn to play chess in order to write about Duchamp.
But you never play chess with Duchamp? Have you ever played chess with Duchamp?
No.
One thing I remember you told me was how, in fact, Rauschenberg and Johns were very respectful of Duchamp, to the point also they didn't want to appear to be friends of him or kind of socially too involved with him, and there was a kind of deferential respect.
Yeah, but they obviously had enormous respect for him, and with good reason, because although neither Rauschenberg nor Johns, their work was never directly influenced by Duchamp, but getting to know his work better and meeting him had the effect of giving a validity to what they were doing. A lot of people in the art world thought what they were doing was horrible and not art and had no relation to art at the beginning. And knowing more about Duchamp and his work made them feel validated, made them feel that they were on the track that they wanted to be on.
Yeah, famously, Jones, he wrote in the obituary about Duchamp that Duchamp changed the conditions of being here, whatever that means. It's,
yeah, he did. Yes, another critic said after Duchamp, it was impossible to do art as it had been done.
Mm-hmm. Another great anecdote, and I'm sorry to bring them all up, but is how you describe the trip of Rauschenberg and Jones at Philadelphia Museum to see the works. And there's also a funny occurrence with a guard. I don't know if you remember it.
Yeah, they went down together on the train because neither one of them had seen the work itself. They'd seen reproductions. And they spent quite a while in the Duchamp rooms of the Philadelphia Museum, where most of the work is. And at one point, Rauschenberg walked right up to the little, why not sneeze, the little bird cage with a piece of cuttlebone sticking out and what looks like sugar cubes in it, but they're cubes of marble. And it's in the show here, and the great thing is that they put a mirror underneath it so you can read the title, which is on the bottom. It says, "Why not sneeze, Rose Celavi?" But Bob was looking at it. He went really close to it, and he put his finger in. He wanted to see what the marble cube felt like. And a guard rushed over. So you can't do that. You can't do that. And he said, and Rauschenberg apologized and said, I just want to feel what it was. And the guard said, you're never supposed to touch any of this crap.
So let's now fast forward to when you met Jeff Koons.
Jeff, I can't actually remember. It was sometime in the 70s. I met sort of glancingly. But then the first time I really saw anything of him personally and had conversations was at the Venice Biennale in, I think it was 91?
In 1990.
1990. And Jeff had this Made in Heaven series was at the Arsenale, these large photo murals of him and Cicciolina. And it was the talk of the Biennale. It was the great sensation of the Biennale. And Dodi and I spent some time with him, and there were all sorts of strange little occasions, but I'm not sure if it was at this point that he said to Dodi, he said, in the 20th century, there was Picasso, and then there was Duchamp. And now I'm leading us into the 21st century.
and that was, another fateful encounter. And I remember Dodi at the time published what must have been the first profile on Koons and Cicciolina in Vogue magazine with photographs by Karl Lagerfeld. That's also interesting because Jeff was at the same time a young artist, but was in a moment of kind of transforming himself into a superstar. And the photo shoot was organized at the Danieli Hotel, and Dodi was saying that the manager thought that they were shooting some porn movie up there, and everybody was very nervous. And but that's how you spend more time. And the piece that Dodi wrote is full of some of the greatest and craziest quotes by Jeff. He was at the top of his kind of delusional grandeur at that point. And, the interesting thing, with Jeff is also he finds a way to make grand statements that maybe in the first part of the 20th century would be made with manifestos, but he makes them as sound bites for the press. No, he understood something that broadcasting slogans was a new way of communication.
That's right, and but the other thing that happened after that Biennale, Dodi and I went to Paris, and and called on Tini Duchamp, who was living outside of Fontainebleau. And Marcel had died some years before. But Tini was fascinated hearing about, we talked about the Biennale and the Koons work and all of it. And she said, oh, Marcel would have loved it.
Maybe because of the kinkiness of the whole. Actually, yesterday Jeff told me something quite touching. He said, I met Tini Duchamp too. And I asked him where, and he said when he was working at the Museum of Modern Art, at the front desk, she came and asked for a ticket. And he asked her who she was, and she said, my husband has work in the museum. And so she got a free ticket, and then he realized it was Tini Duchamp. She was there to look at the work. But he found that it was so sweet also that, she just say, my husband has work. She didn't say, I'm Tini Duchamp. So it's also interesting. And that was such a short encounter, but stayed with Jeff.
Stayed with him.
For a long time. So did actually Koons speak to you about Duchamp much? Because then you went on to write a long profile on him.
On him, yeah.
Years later. And you wrote also some of the greatest first-hand accounts of the Neo Geo. There is a book of yours called From Post to Neo, the chronicles, particularly that moment with the Sonoben show and so on. But so did Jeff speak to you about Duchamp?
I don't remember talking about Duchamp, but from the very beginning of his work, it was so evident what the ready-mades had meant to him and to his work. In a way, I think he says himself that his work is actually based on the ready-made, and it's interesting because the works that they did that are most closely related to the ready-made are very, very different. Duchamp said from the beginning, he said that in choosing the objects that would become ready-mades, he made himself be guided by visual indifference. He said this a number of times. The visual indifference. He didn't want the objects to look like art in any way, and they don't. In a way, the ready-mades have this history of being an antidote to art, that they're works of art. But Marcel never actually said they were works of art. He never tried to sell them. 3 of them were hanging in a gallery show in New York, but most people didn't even know that what they were. They thought there was just some furniture left around, a hat rack and things like that. And most of them he gave away to friends, to Breton and other friends. And it wasn't until when was the Schwartz replica?
64.
Until 64, that he agreed to this thing that seemed to be the absolute reversal of the ready-made idea of having the most significant ready-mades remade by professional craftsmen, and so they became, instead of being ready-made objects that could be seen as works of art, they were created works of art that were based on ordinary objects.
And Calvin had, I would believe, unique experience of being present at the presentation of those works in 1965 at Cordier Ekstrom, and then writing about it in 2015 on the occasion. And I remember on that occasion you say how struck you were by how at ease they felt in their new role of works of art. You found them paradoxically almost endearing in their appearance of works of art, not as... objects.
Yeah, but the ready-mades, Duchamp once said that he felt that with the ready-mades, he had been able to deny the possibility of defining art. And I think this is the thing that Koons and so many other younger artists have imbibed into their bloodstream. It's the idea that art is not some special thing that can be defined, can be pinned down, that it can be anything. This was his great liberating act. He changed the game. He changed the idea, and he brought in this idea that art can be anything.
I think I might be misquoting you, but I think somewhere you say that each generation invents their own Duchamp, no? How do you think the Duchamp of Rauschenberg and Jones differs from the Duchamp of Koons and Prince and Barbara Kruger or Sherry Levine?
I think it differs in each artist. That's the freedom that Duchamp gave to artists was that everybody can invent his own Duchamp. Nobody makes works that looks really just like a Duchamp's ready-mades. But they have the freedom to make art out of whatever they want.
And that might also have to do with the way in which he imagined himself as a kind of multiple identity, no? And I kind of jump ahead about how both Koons and Duchamp play with identity as a medium. No, famously, and that's also what the exhibition alludes to, presenting so many different Duchamps with a wig, with a necklace. Right. And so how would you describe Duchamp's persona or Koons' persona? And do you see any similarity in theirs? In the catalog, you say something very nice that Duchamp is a monk and Koons is a messiah, no?
An evangelist.
An evangelist. A door-to-door evangelist.
Yeah, well, the thing that sort of amazed me about Jeff when I first met him was that was the way he talked about himself and his art. And Jeffrey and Linda gave some great examples of that just now. But with Jeff, the thing that struck me first was that there was an unshakable sincerity about him. I've never met anybody as sincere. And at first I thought, is this a put-on? Is he kidding us? He would say things like, taking us into the 21st century is a put-on. And I came to the realization that it never was, that he means every word he says. And this is somehow very endearing. It goes along with his very endearing personality. He's absolutely serious and absolutely sincere about everything he does. But Duchamp is the absolute opposite. Duchamp is the master skeptic. He did something rather revolutionary in bringing humor into art, deliberately, and that person made a huge influence on Cage. Cage was asked once if he meant for people to laugh at some of his performances, like when he's making sounds inside a conch shell, and Cage said, "I prefer laughter to tears."
Well, yesterday we were doing an interview with Jeff, and somebody asked him, "How do you feel about the fact that many people might see your work just as fun?" And he said, "I think that's a tragedy." And it's it's rare also for him to say it, but it's interesting how, well, which goes back to Duchamp's idea that the viewer makes the work. But with Koons, we also witness the viewers maybe flattening the work more than making it, no? Or Or anyway, bringing a kind of simplistic view to
a simplistic view. But Duchamp would not have been in the least bothered if he were told that his work made people laugh.
Yeah. I want to ask you two more questions. One is that they clearly, both Duchamp and Koons, have interesting relationships with sex.
Yes.
What is your take on Duchamp's sexuality, if you have any, and on Jeff's use of sex also in the work?
Yeah, well, Duchamp, whose work was deeply involved with sex, or rather with eros. Duchamp said once that that eroticism was the only ism he could believe in, but he did believe it. He thought it was indispensable, and it certainly is a guiding force in the first major breakthrough work, the large glass, but I think in Duchamp's work leading up to the glass, there's a lot of very sexy paintings. The Bride, which is in your show, the passage from the Virgin to the Bride, they're not quite abstract. They're what look like organs, internal organs in them. You feel like you're inside the body. And the strange, subtle colors of ochre and yellow that you get in these two paintings are somehow very erotic. And directly erotic.
One of the two he painted with his hands, no? At one point, didn't he?
What?
In one, I don't remember if it's the Bride or he also used his fingers.
His fingers. But in that sense, I've always found Duchamp's work truly erotic in a way that Jeff's is not. In the Made in Heaven series, you have very explicit images of sexual intercourse, and it's all it's so explicit, nothing held back, no subtleties. For some reason, it doesn't strike me as being erotic at all. Whereas with Duchamp, there's a real an erotic sensation that comes from looking at some of these works. The other thing that I think is very interesting is that in the large glass, the woman is in charge. The woman is the primary actor, and the men, the bachelors, the bride stripped bare by her bachelors. The bachelors are subsidiary to the bride. She's the one who controls the game, and this oddly, when he was making this painting, it coincides with the high point of the suffrage movement in this country. But his work, in a way, empowers the women in a way that I don't think had been done before.
This may be the last question. Famously, it was in 1913, Apollinaire wrote a short text in his book about Cubism, in which he says that the fate of an artist as detached from aesthetic preoccupations as Marcel Duchamp will be to reconcile art and the people. Yeah. And that's a premise of this exhibition, because certainly Koons has reconciled art and the people. But do you have any thought about what Apollinaire was saying and how he plays out with Duchamp and Koons?
I asked Marcel about that quote. And he said, well, Apollinaire was a nice fellow, but he wrote foolish things about art. but I think there's some truth in it. I mean, Marcel Duchamp is the one who said the artist performs one part of the creative act, only one part, and the spectator completes it by judging and deciding its place in art history. So he's giving a lot of power to the people, all power to the people, and I think in a way that I'm not sure whether he's given the people what Apollinaire said he might, but there's that element anyway.
Well, thank you so much. I don't know if we can take a question from the people or not. Would you be comfortable if there was a question?
But you'll have to have it relayed to me because my hearing is
okay. Are we taking questions or not? Or does anybody have a genius question to ask? No pressure. And otherwise, we just thank you, Calvin. Thank you, Pat.